Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third Farmers Weekly Transition Summit. My name is Andrew Meredith. I'm the editor of Farmers Weekly, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. In this 5-part webinar series, we're taking a closer look at all the issues related to preparing to adapt your farm business to survive and thrive as farm subsidies change and new environmental schemes are introduced. This is just one part of our transition project, which also includes coverage in print, on our website, and a special podcast series. In each strand, we aim to bring together farmers from around the country and representatives from all parts of the agricultural industry to exchange views and tackle problems amid some of the biggest changes to farming we've seen in decades. Our industry, like the rest of the country, is currently gripped by rising inflation. The dairy sector, red meat producers and growers of combinable crops may be enjoying some of the best prices in years, but all are seeing the costs of production rise as well. And for other sectors, like pigs, things are worse. Prices have slumped in the last 12 months without costs falling. Indeed, they're rising too, feed costs and many other things. So this evening, it seems the ideal time to have a special focus on improving productivity, the art of producing the same output with fewer inputs or more output with the same inputs. Productivity has become one of those catch-all words that can mean so many things in different contexts that it almost means nothing to some people. But I hope by the end of this evening, you'll have learned something new that has inspired you to get stuck in and tweak this or that on your farm. Tonight, I'm delighted to be joined by representatives from a number of our transition partners across 2 panels for a look at this issue from a variety of viewpoints. In the first session, the first panel discussion, we'll be looking at it from an enterprise basis and gleaning some tips for both red meat producers and arable farmers. And in the second session, we'll be honing in on business structures, government support, and taking a close look at a very topical productivity issue, making the most of nitrogen in grassland and arable. Before we get started though, let's first of all hear a bit more on the topic of productivity from our transition editor, Johan Tasker, and then we'll watch a second video from our transition partner, ABN, before we come back for our first panel discussion.
Welcome to the latest Transition Summit, the series of Farmers Weekly webinars aimed at securing a more sustainable future for your farm business. I'm Transition Editor Johan Tasker. This summit focuses on productivity and the need for farmers to secure more of their income from the marketplace. Productivity, the ratio by which inputs are turned into outputs, has seldom been more important. Farm policy is changing and we can no longer rely on the basic payment to support agriculture. Now, when it comes to productivity, it's often been said that UK farmers languish behind their overseas competitors. But as we'll see, the true picture is much more complicated than it first appears. Even so, there are actions that every farm can take to improve its business performance, whether it's embracing innovation and new practices, collaborating and sharing knowledge, or simply doing everything that little bit better. Being more productive isn't about chasing yields, although of course yields are important. It's about optimising that ratio of inputs to outputs in a way that aligns with our own personal and business goals. As always, we're grateful to our transition farmers for sharing their stories with us, and we're grateful too to our transition partners for sharing their knowledge and expertise along the way.
As we enter a period of challenge and change, productivity, farm efficiency and precision feeding are going to be driving forces in the future success of the UK pig and poultry industry. We are seeing increasing demands placed upon our supply chains across all areas, from rising input costs and raw material availability to constantly evolving sustainability and environmental standards. What is clear is the UK industry must find new ways to be efficient if it is to remain competitive.
By 2050, forecasts estimate the population of the UK will be approximately 77 million, resulting in an increased demand for animal protein products. It is projected that chicken production will need to increase by 5 million birds per week, requiring an additional 1 million tonnes of feed, and pig production will need to increase by 115,000 pigs per week, requiring an additional 1.8 million tonnes of feed per year.
In 2021, ABN announced its intention to build the UK's largest and most futuristic state-of-the-art animal feed mill to meet capacity challenges for pig and poultry feed manufacturing in the UK. As the pig and poultry sector address this growing demand, they also face the additional challenges from coronavirus, the next phase of Brexit, as well as meeting net zero and sustainability responsibilities.
In uncertain times, the importance of high performance across every stage of the supply chain only increases.
As well as keeping pace with growing demands, we are prioritising productivity in an ever-changing world. With energy costs incredibly high and extremely volatile raw material costs, productivity becomes of increasing importance. Every ounce of performance you can get out of the bird or pig is essentially saving you money. We are constantly evaluating our product range and refining it to meet today's demands. At the same time, we are always looking at potential future raw materials to see how they could fit into a productive feeding programme. Feed today is very much valued on a least cost basis, when tomorrow there will be a greater emphasis towards a least carbon basis. These two factors frequently oppose each other, but by looking at efficiency and productivity alongside sustainability, we can help bring a cost balance for the producer. This is where a focus on feeding programme, balancing the right nutrition for the stage or level of production becomes more important.
I've been leading a team that has been increasing our understanding of the sustainability of ABN's feeds, utilising data from the GFLI Global Feed Lifecycle Analysis database. We have, for example, been profiling raw materials and where they're sourced to effectively build a database of their carbon emissions, incorporating impacts like transport. This will help our customers benchmark where they currently are before exploring alternatives to reduce their footprint. We acknowledge that we're at the beginning of this journey and will be working in partnership with our customers to achieve the best balance of performance, sustainability and efficiency that works for them.
We are engaging with our customers to gain insight into their needs for the future. We will be adopting relevant innovation and technologies where appropriate to support them in achieving their goals to deliver a great product and a sustainable proposition for the UK consumer. More than ever, our industry needs a partner that delivers for them. ABN will be the business to do that.
Welcome back, everyone, and thanks to Johan and ABN for those thought-provoking videos to get us started. I was struck by the increasing requirements that ABN highlighted at the beginning of that video, and while there's always challenges in farming, as we'll address this evening, rising demand for our products means grounds for optimism, I'm sure you'll agree, and we'll want to rise that challenge in the most efficient way possible. So let's turn to our first panel to get the conversation started straight away. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by four very knowledgeable guests. We have Joshua Batterham, a ruminant veterinary consultant with Zoetis, the American drug company that is the world's largest producer of medicine and vaccinations for pets and livestock, and he's a specialist in dairy genetics. We have Matt Daffin, a climate activation manager with agrochemical and seed giant Bayer, and he's working on their digital farming platform FieldView. We have Duncan Rawson, who's a partner with the agri-food consultancy business EFFP, the European Food and Farming Partnership. And this evening he is here primarily representing Kellogg's and their Origins program, which has a strong focus on productivity. And finally, John Richards, Industry Development and Relations Manager with Welsh Levy Board Hubby Keed Cymru. He's responsible for developing plans to improve sustainability and competitiveness in the supply chain, including their Red Meat Development Programme. So John, if you don't mind, I'm going to come to you straight away. What is productivity from your perspective, and from the perspective of the farmers you're working with, would you say it's a big old term, isn't it? So what are you sort of focusing on when you think about this debate?
Yeah, it's a big term and it's widely used, and that's one of the challenges. It's widely used and it's probably got many different definitions within the individuals that actually use that, which I think can be problematic, but it also shows how much it has come to people's mindset now. For ourselves, and I think it's been mentioned earlier, productivity would be a driver for producing more from the kind of resources that we currently use, or producing the same amount from less resources, whichever way you want to look at it. And actually, if you can produce more from less resources, which would be the ideal scenario in all this. But what is also important within that is actually maintaining and improving the kind of natural resources we use in order to achieve that. You know, that can't be overlooked in the importance of this, and that's the natural capital that we've got, such as our land, our water, the air, and all this has to be maintained and improved within that as well. So it's not just a case of what we produce, but it's ensuring that what we produce in the future is also not affected by what we're doing at this present moment in time, and that's vitally important really as well.
And just hone in on then a couple of areas in this red meat development programme then. Where do you think, if there are any, the low-hanging fruit are, or the areas where farmers may in a few years' time be able to look around and see, gosh, I've really made some big progress here?
Well, the red meat development programme, specifically on the kind of farm level, as far as what we're actually delivering on farm, is looking at some key areas, and those being animal health and welfare, and that's within the suckler herds and also within the sheep flock, and it's also genetics, and specifically genetics in the kind of hill area, in the hill scheme. So it's called the hill ram scheme. And I think those two areas, together with nutrition, are obviously the three pillars to kind of improve productivity. And the low-hanging fruit, as far as what we're doing with the Hill Stock Plus, and that's the animal health project, is obviously, first of all, understanding current performance. And then there are, obviously, we all want to find that silver bullet, which just we alleviate all the ills by doing a few actions. Unfortunately, life's never that easy, and it's a cumulative effect. But what we've already seen, and we've seen some very good progress on some farms already with this, is just identifying key areas of concern, and then starting delving into the information and working with the farm vet and identifying where the problems are. And I think we've already seen it. And for example, calving, when we talk about, there was a mention earlier in the presentation about least farming in a least carbon basis. One of the emphasis on that would be how many kilograms are produced. That is your carbon footprint, if you like, is an equation where it is divided by the amount of kilograms produced. So actually, if we can produce more calves per cow during its lifetime, or if we can produce more kind of viable and economic calves in the suckler herd every year, then clearly that's going to have a positive impact. And we've started to see those kind of effects come through in the programme already.
Brilliant. Josh, let me bring you in here straight away when we're thinking about genetic development and improvements of breeds in the red meat sector in beef and sheep. There's a bit of a tendency to think perhaps progress has been quite sluggish there compared to maybe even the dairy sector. Let's get straight to it. Are we working with too many breeds? Is that the problem, or why are they lagging behind perhaps other sectors of farming?
A big part of it comes down to data. So with dairy, we've had an awful lot of data fed through the milk recording organisations for a long time. A lot of conditions are recorded very accurately on dairy farms and fed into evaluations. So it's much easier to develop the databases that feed into genetic evaluations for dairy than it has been historically for beef and sheep. But that said, we're definitely getting there. It's an interesting question about the number of different breeds, and it came up at the BC conference earlier this week. Yes, in a word, you could make faster genetic progress if we really put all of our efforts into one breed. There's obviously pros and cons to sort of crossbreeding versus single breeds. Genetic gain within a breed is additive, so we can sort of generate genomic databases, and we can work with genomic data within a breed. It's much harder when you're comparing apples with pears across breeds. So that is something that we're looking at for individual breeds. The question then becomes, what about inbreeding values? You need a certain amount of inbreeding to fix traits, and that's a beneficial thing. We want to fix traits such as health traits, productivity traits, efficiency traits. So we do need a level of inbreeding, but it's obviously something that needs managing.
And John, that hill round program then, is that honing in on a few breeds? Have they sort of made a strategic bet on which might be the breeds of the future for the uplands?
Great question. What the hill round scheme is it's a program that we've put in place, a scheme that we've put in place where we're looking at performance recording in the hill sector and the challenges that exist in that. When the program started, when the scheme started then, I think we had 7 performance recorded hill farms then with hill breeds. And we can understand what the challenges would be with regard to the kind of the extensive nature of those farms, and many of them lambing outdoors, and not wanting to interfere at that crucial point where the lamb and the mother are starting to get that connection. But what we've done through the hill ram scheme is invest in new technology, TSU, tissue sampling units, which means actually there's no need to interfere at that point of lambing. So you can identify then the sire and the dam from the kind of information that's collected in the tissue samples then analysed. Some of those farms are already making great progress. I mean, the challenge that we have got, and I think Josh alluded to that, genetic gain in kind of ruminant systems, particularly red meat systems, is a slow process. Because ultimately the production cycle is more elongated than it would be, say, in pigs or certainly in poultry. So it's a long-term investment that needs to be put in there, and that is one of the challenges. But as far as the hill ram scheme goes, what we're trying to do is invest in the hill ram sector as a whole, and then you can have that kind of drip feed effect across the whole sector from having superior genetics, if you like, in the hill sector to start off with.
And Josh, then in the dairy sector, which sort of has made more of this progress because they've been better with data, that doesn't mean they've already got to the most efficient cow, then, does it? What are the sort of headline traits farmers should be focusing on now in the next sort of 5 years, would you say, as an industry? Perhaps, I know there's always variation at a farm level.
It's got to be breeding that all-round cow. So we've chased production for a long time to the detriment of fertility, and then the indexes have done a nice job of correcting that. So we now made sort of decent progress genetically on fertility and productivity, which is great. I think the next big push is adding health and efficiency into that mix. So there's plenty of traits out there now that look at feed efficiency and health. So we can now predict which animals are more or less likely to go down with individual diseases during the course of their lifetime. And there's fantastic potential to use that data to then select the animals that are going to be a better herd going forward, and also making sure that you're breeding the next generation out of the ones that are least susceptible to disease, most prone to produce lots of milk and be an efficient animal. So it's finding that well-rounded animal. And I think that sort of message is definitely resonating when we're having these discussions with commercial dairies.
Duncan, if I may, I'm going to bring you in here now, because Josh makes an important point. Perhaps agriculture as a whole has chased perhaps output at the expense of other traits, whether it's the dairy sector, breeding that high-yielding cow, or the arable sector chasing a variety that focuses only on tons per acre. Both in arable and dairy, then, would you say perhaps is a shifting away from that sort of emphasis now as we look to phase out subsidy payments? It's more an all-round package, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely right, and there's always been an inherent danger in just chasing yield, whether that's yield of wheat or barley or yield of cows. It's really now started to, which we should be anyway, focusing on margin effectively. Are we profitable? Are we not profitable? And reacting to that. And I think it's with the reduction in subsidies we're facing into, but also some of the sustainability challenges that are coming down the line towards us at the moment. the more that we can actually focus on, like I say, the margin that we're making on the business, the better. And that's got to be the key driver. And it's not just about margin today. There's a nuance here as well. It's not just about margin today or even next year. We've got to be thinking about how we secure our margin in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 15, 20 years as well, which is where the whole sustainability piece starts to come back into that. Because at the end of the day, sustainability is categorized into 3 different areas. It's environmental sustainability, which is what most people talk about. There's also social sustainability. There's also financial sustainability, because if we're not in the black, we can't go into the green, sort of thing. We've got to get all 3 pillars of that right.
And in terms of subsidy, then, it's such a hot topic at the moment. Historically, when there were payments headage or per tonne back in the 90s and earlier, that would have driven farmers to have a real focus on output. Has the industry, since it went to an area system, do you think, sort of taken a step back from a focus on productivity? And do you think sort of peeling away, do you think there's some upsides to peeling away subsidy? Are people going to be much more, have much more business clarity in the future, do you think, in some ways?
I absolutely think so. I've always been of the view that subsidies have actually been a bad thing for the industry, particularly subsidies that push production, push output. They've stifled innovation. They've actually stifled productivity. But also, not a lot of subsidy actually sticks on farm. It doesn't actually create a huge amount of benefit for the farmer anyway. I mean, it drives into lower food prices as you go down the supply chain, and there's questions about high prices, low prices. That's probably a different debate. But it also disappears into input prices. It disappears into land prices, into rents, and et cetera, et cetera. So not a lot of subsidy actually sticks on farm. But at the same time, it's driven, perhaps, looking back in hindsight over the last 20, 30 years or so, it's driven behaviours that haven't been in the best interest of farmers, I don't think, overall, and certainly not in the best interest of the environment either.
Max, why don't you come in here? Do you think sustainability and productivity are sort of at loggerheads with one another, or is it something, are the 2 compatible?
Yeah, I think the 2 are very much compatible. I mean, to me, productivity is all about maximizing or getting the most out of any input that you're applying. So if you're optimizing the way that you apply your inputs and grow your crops, you're going to be farming in a more sustainable way. And I think you can look at it conversely as well. And I think actually sustainability can help you farm in a more productive way. If you're farming in a more sustainable, regenerative way, that's going to give you, improve your soil health. It could encourage beneficials. So that's going to mean that your land is more resilient and ultimately more productive.
And there's a slew of products on the market at the moment helping farmers capture the data they need to make these decisions. You obviously with Bayer are working on one of them. Without sort of going into the intricacies of one versus the other, what's your pitch to farmers who, they don't really like to spend much time in the office, they're not sure it's worth their time, gathering this information? Why is that such an important part of the productivity puzzle from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, one of the things I'm aware of is farmers are amassing huge amounts of data on farm, and they keep being told this data is valuable. But actually, it's only valuable if you're using that data to inform some sort of decision making. And I think a lot of farmers have been lacking those tools to allow them to utilize the data to inform those decisions. So I think one of the key things is to actually allow farmers who are collecting this data and have got a huge history of this data to start unlocking some of the value that it holds. I think with the other thing with technology is there is, like you say, Andrew, there's so much out there, so many different platforms, and farmers need to know where they should invest their time and where they're likely to get a return from investing their time. I don't think farmers should adopt technology just for the sake of adopting technology, and I think you can be at risk of adopting some new technology and then looking for a problem that technology solves. I think a much better approach is to try and identify what are some of the main challenges or issues that you face, and then what technologies might be available to help you face those challenges.
So one of the key areas that farmers, are entering the new environmental scheme, sustainable farming incentive, and all those others in England, and we're looking forward to finding out more details of the ones in other parts of the country. But we're always been told at the moment, it seems like, there's pockets of land in a lot of arable farms, shall we say, which really they shouldn't be growing crops on at all. Those are the unprofitable areas, and that's perhaps one of the most important things, is identifying those. How do people go about honing in on those first of all, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that most farmers will recognise that their fields aren't uniformly productive, and there will be areas within those fields that probably aren't economically viable to farm, particularly with rising input costs. So I think trying to identify those areas is absolutely key. And there are a number of tools that you can use to help you identify those, such as satellite imagery. Satellite imagery has been available for a long time, so you can get years worth of satellite data on any given field within the UK, going back several years, and that will allow you to identify areas that are consistently underperforming. Lots of farmers have got many years worth of yield data as well, so you start layering up all these different data layers on which to make decisions. And there are also platforms out there that allow you to put in your input costs and assign that to a yield map and actually generate a profitability map, so you can see what parts of the fields are under delivering and are uneconomical and maybe suited for other uses or other schemes.
Duncan, is that what you've been working on with the farmers in the Origins programme, or has there been what's another thing perhaps that they've been honing in on?
Yeah, but with Origins, we haven't really got down to that level of detail yet, albeit we're sitting with a bunch of progressive farmers, so a lot of them are doing that kind of analysis themselves anyway. But we've been in quite a lot of work on nitrogen utilization and efficiency over the last couple of years, which is quite an interesting thing to look at. And one of the steps, the next steps of that we're considering at the moment, is can we actually start to map nitrogen utilization efficiency across a field, for instance, or across the farm at a more granular level, and use that as an indicator as to whether we should be pursuing that for growing crops, or pursuing that for other benefits, for other land use, etc. So it's a similar sort of thing. It's as driving productivity. Looking at profitability across the farm, but it's just another way of potentially looking at it.
And great to have bring a group of progressive farmers like that together. I'm sure there's been a lot of different ideas sparked off in those conversations. What are perhaps those ones at the cutting edge talking about that might become ideas that may become more mainstream in the next few years? What should other farmers be looking out for there? Some of the more it's not wacky ideas, but the more exciting ideas, shall we say?
Well, I suppose there's a couple of things that are sort of live at the moment, if you like. One is the nitrogen utilization work, and it amuses me that a year ago when we were kicking off this work, or 18 months ago, we asked how many farmers are interested, and we got 4 or 5 farmers are interested. I asked that question again in December this last year, and every hand went up in the room. It's amazing what increases in prices do, but everybody's sort of interested in that, because that has great financial benefits as well as great environmental benefits as well there. The other area that we're sort of looking at the moment is looking at the technology and looking at the use of drones to support agronomic decisions as well, and what role they have. So it's very much explorative, and we're very much with an open mind working with a company at the moment who are developing technology in that area. So how can we support agronomic decisions and help farmers make better decisions? As all farmers know, there's very rarely is there a sort of a black and white answer or a black and white decision that you can make. So we're all about trying to help farmers take better bets and reduce the risk of decision making that they're having to make, and increasingly are going to have to make as well.
Josh, some of these decisions, isn't it, like in every sector, in the pace of farming, sometimes problems come at you fast, but progress seems awfully slow. Now, I know you've done a lot of work on genomics. What's your pitch to farmers there? It's speeding up the pace of breeding decisions. That's the big benefit, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Duncan said the point really nicely. It's about making better, more accurate decisions, and that's what genomics allows us to do. On the livestock side, is choosing which animals should go down a certain route, which ones should get sex semen, which should get beef, which should stay in the herd, which should maybe be sold. And there's a whole wealth of data that we can get back, highly reliable data using genomics that we've never had before. But again, coming back to Max's point, it's how you making sure you use that data to make decisions. Just having the data alone is no good. So making sure that you've got decent support. So yeah, having the tools, whether that's software or physical tools, or the people behind the scenes to actually help guide you through the process and make those better decisions is absolutely key. So working with your advisors, so whether that be your vet or your nutritionist, your farm advisors, really key to listen to their advice and take their advice on the data to make sure that you're using it properly.
And do we still have John on the line? I was going to come to John next.
Yes, you can. I think you can hear me, but it might be fortunately you can't see me.
That's all right, John. John, I was just going to pick up on that point about using the data then in the red meat sector, sheep and beef farmers. There seems to have been 5 different launches of EBVs, and they never really catch fire with some farmers, or they perhaps like the cereal farmers, they collect a lot of this data and then don't know what to do with it. Is there a role for the rest of the supply chain here, or should it be farmers doing this off their own back? Can they really find the benefits on their own for these things?
It's a combination of both, Andrew, in my view. And yes, there's a lot of information being collected. In some cases, and on some individual businesses, it would be good if more information could be collected. But it's knowing we can collect all manner of information on every farming system. Some of it's useful, some of it won't be. And what's needed is that kind of industry input about what is the important information to collect. Because at the end of the day, it's all, whatever information is collected doesn't come easy. There's a resource required in order to collect it. So what we have to do is ensure that the information that's collected has the maximum benefit for the business. And if we can do that, that's the starting point. And I think while there are unforeseen circumstances and there are challenges, that has to be a bit of a. I think we are at the point though where there have been historically red meat businesses typically have been poor and poorer than in collecting some of this key information. But we are seeing a change now. That there has been a change over the last decade or so when we have got some really forward-thinking businesses now that know their business inside out and know all the information that's collected. And what we are doing and what we need to do, and Farmers Weekly ourselves and those in the supply chain that provide the information, use those as exemplars about the kind of information, but then provide the tools there for those businesses that aren't maybe as advanced in the collection of information about how to get to that. Because obviously, if you've been collecting information and it becomes second nature to you for the last 20 years, for example, for somebody starting that process, it can seem a bit daunting because there's so much information and where do I start? So it's breaking it down into bite-sized bits. This is the first thing to do, and then we can move on to the second stage. And it's that understanding that is cumulative over time, and that's how you end up in this, having businesses that are strong and viable and actually knowing their cost of production, their carbon footprint, and whatever the challenges in the future can bring.
So somebody on that journey then, let's say they're a fat lamb producer, they want to get involved this lambing, they want to start collecting data, what would be your recommendation, the simplest thing to collect, and how much they got to spend, would you say, to just have the basic setup?
Well, and this is the point of interest I always think, is that we have got information already in our records, whether it's number of lambs sold, whether it's your scanning percentage compared to your rearing percentage. And if we just start on those information, so it's not a massive investment of cost into different, we can all buy different livestock management systems and all this, but as a starting point, let's get back to basics. Number of ewes, number of lambs born, number of lambs reared. Those are the type of information that we can start on. And then we can get into, dates of sales and weights. And those are all readily information. And you can start getting that kind of daily live weight gain information, all that's associated with it. And even without going into great cost and using a lot of different information tools, you've already got a good minefield to start going through there that would actually give you a very good indication as to the basic performance of the farm. And then you add on to that the key point about red meat farms is the utilization of grasslands. Then we can start looking at a kind of metrics associated with that about how many kilograms produced of grass, etc., etc. And these are the drivers for productivity and I would suggest also profitability.
And Josh, in the animal health sphere, then you as a veterinary consultant, the production diseases, those low-lying things that are sort of there in the background of a lot of flocks and herds, are they the key focus rather than these sort of acute disease outbreaks for a lot of farmers? Then is it tackling all those things that you can just about ignore on a day-to-day basis if you're not paying attention?
I think so. I think there is a lot of low-lying fruit there on certain units. There's very few livestock units that I've been to that have got everything under control. They do exist, but there's always room for improvement. And I think, again, listening to what your vets and advisors are talking about in terms of disease prevention is absolutely key. Prevention is always better than cure. You're better off putting in a decent herd health plan and vaccinating for things that are likely to pop up or have popped up previously. Pneumonia is a great example, really common on a lot of beef and dairy units, and easily preventable in a lot of cases. So there's vaccinations out there for all the different pathogens that cause pneumonia, and there's lots of little things you can do in terms of improving colostrum management, nutrition, temperature of calf sheds, ventilation. You name it, there's a long list of things that we can be doing to improve conditions. And a case of pneumonia has a huge impact on the rest of the lifespan of that animal. So it's thinking about the full production cycle rather than just the here and now. So a couple of coughing calves might not seem like a big deal, but there's papers to show just how much impact that has on their later sort of yield going into the milking herd or the time to fattening on the beef side.
Max or Duncan, one of you want to jump in and answer this? You've got a question here from Christian Murray, and he's asking, how do livestock owners review soil health, and how often should they be doing it, and to what level of detail? Real focus on soil health from the sustainable farming incentive is going to be some rewards around that. So what are the early steps farmers should be taking on the arable side first of all?
Well, it's an interesting question if you're comparing arable farming with livestock farming, and hopefully Max will have some more detailed data here, but I can only sort of share what I know anecdotally, and that is, I think quite a lot of livestock farmers out there will be doing sort of basic NPK type of soil analysis, but not taking it much further than that, and not taking it, really starting to think about soil health and soil structure. And those sorts of things. I mean, it's interesting in terms of some of the work that I do on the dairy sector. We are starting to push into that sort of direction and trying to push farmers there. And certainly some of the work I was doing with the Nestle farmers over the years, we certainly were pushing them down that route. And there's some quite basic things we can do. You start by increasing the amount of soil analysis that you're actually doing. But then you can start doing things like visual assessments of your soil structure. They're not difficult to do. AHDB have got some great resources online in terms of how to do that. So start thinking about, what's your soil structure like? If you've got areas of compaction, how do you start to draw those out as well? And then really simple things like worm counts. I mean, worm counts are very, very powerful indicators of how healthy the soil is. And particularly when in dairy systems where you've got quite heavy levels of slurries might be going on field at sometimes, or slurry and worms don't go together, they're not particularly good bedfellows and things like that. So it's thinking about those things as well. So if you look across the industry, sort of try and summarize this ramble, arable farmers have still got quite a long way to go, I think, from a broad point of view. There's some guys out there doing great work, but they've got a long way to go in terms of understanding their soil health. But I would say the livestock sector is sitting somewhere behind that at the moment as well.
Max?
Yeah, just to add, I think it's kind of echoed Duncan's comments. I think the most important thing you can probably do is to make sure whatever approach you're going to take to soil health, start by measuring. You know, it's that old adage, you can only manage what you can measure. So I think that the key thing is to really to start soil sampling and routine soil sampling. And when you are soil sampling, you know, think about where you're taking samples from. So, you know, is the soil type uniform across a field? And if not, then you want to be taking samples from areas of soils that are similar. And then there's a whole suite of different soil health tests you can run now in the different labs as well. So the thing I would say is pick one lab and stick. What you don't want to do is test in one method and then test another 3 or 4 years later. So you want to try and get a baseline of where you are now with any test or any lab that you choose. And then as you adopt or try new approaches to try and improve your soil health, use those same measurements in 3 or 4 years' time to see where you've come.
And you know, how laborious is it if some people, perhaps let's say they're only doing their MPs and Ks at the moment, are we talking big cost and big time expense? What's the situation?
No, I mean, in terms of time expense, it's the same process. If you're collecting the sample for PK, MG, pH, it's just a case of requesting additional analysis from the lab. In some cases, you need a small amount of extra soil. But the labs now offer a whole suite of different soil health testing services. So it's no extra work for yourself. And in terms of cost, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to do it on every sample. You could just target it to areas where you're going to try a new approach, or where you're interested, or where you've got good or bad performance in the field. So I think the cost, wouldn't be prohibitive.
I would say that it'd be more costly not to do it. You know, there's a direct link between soil health and then grass health and then animal health. So to not get your soil nutrition right, it would be more costly than the actual physical cost of doing the test error. So.
And is there any particular farmer that you sort of are working with, Duncan, that has cut through some of these issues in the last few years and has really been able to make smart tweaks to their system, would you say?
Yes. I mean, to sort of bring it back to the Kelloggs farmers, if you like. I mean, the Kelloggs farmers are progressive farmers, but certainly some of the activities that we've been involved with has changed the way that those farmers are farming. It's given them the confidence, if you like, and a lot of the ethos that sits behind the Kelloggs work is doing trials on farm, but backed up with scientific rigor. So, you know, we've worked with NIAP, for instance, to make sure that trials that we're running are got proper controls in place and are done in a proper way. But because they're on farm, it gives the farmers the confidence to actually then take up the practice that we've been trialing. And, you know, the examples of that with some of our cover crop work that we're doing quite a number of years ago when it was first sort of coming into vogue and there wasn't a lot of trial work out there. You know, we were able to run some pretty large scale. I mean, they were the biggest cover crop trials in the UK, I believe, at the time. And again, it was, you know, just trying to de-risk decisions, just trying to help farmers make a better decision, to help point them in the right direction. And, you know, following on from that, all of those farmers are routinely using cover crops as part of their rotation and successfully doing so.
Okay, and John, sort of when I think of farmers that you're working with, then we sort of talked about the entry level, but how big is the gap between the best and the rest? What are the guys at the sharp end doing? The ones who are trialing this and that, you know, are they really streets ahead of the average farmer, would you say, at the moment, or is the gap a bit narrower than that?
Well, it's a very difficult question to ask, and I think it's difficult to define what an average farmer is, to be honest, because every individual farm is a business, and those business wants, demands, requirements are all very different. So I think that what I think we have got is some very, you know, forward thinking, you know, and thinking, you know, Farmers Weekly Beef Farmer of the Year, Aled Evans down just outside Whitland, you know, and understands his business like, you know, any successful business would. Know the costs, know the input costs, knows the outputs that they've got. They plan for it. They have business plan meetings on a regular basis about what the challenges are. And these are kind of types of examples of individuals and farms that are actually moving the business on from one year to the next. And it's understanding where we are. That's the first challenge for any business, has been highlighted today. It's understanding where we are, but also being honest and understanding where we want to get to, and writing that. And that is the plan: is where do we want to be in a year's time, or where do we want to be in 5 years' time as a business? And then you take the advice that's available. There's a wide range of services available to give farmers advice and to give businesses advice, and take the best advice. Josh has touched on there, and what has come through from the Stock Plus work, that relationship with the vet cannot be underestimated, the importance of that, and that discussion point about understanding what the local health concerns are, what and a lot of the anecdotal information that we've got is nothing beats actually that discussion for half an hour with the vet about what do you think this is, what do you think that is, because generally we have that discussion when it's a firefighting point, and there's no time at that stage to have a discussion, and just being out on farm, looking at the data, seeing what the performance is, and then starting to do a little bit of investigation, and as soon as that start getting that drip feed of that's a bit more information into the business, it should spark the next stage, which is, well, we've investigated that, let's have a look at this. And it's the same as when it comes to grasslands and agronomy. There are experts out there that can give absolute clear advice about what's the best to do. I can't emphasize enough of what's been said. The starting point of most farms is the soil, and then from that is the grassland, and then we move forward, and then you join in animal health and genetics on top of that, and you've got a very strong business. So that's what I suggest, rather than looking at the difference. I think looking at those characteristics of those ones that are high performing, and it's that almost at times obsessional nature towards the understanding the nuances and the business and the performance of it, and getting the information. And once we get that, we can start making sound business decisions.
You've got a brilliant question coming now from John Price, and he's saying, in the pursuit of marginal gains, what are the panel's thoughts on economies of scale for returning higher margins, and how may this work practically for farmers? I guess in a nutshell, he's saying, are a lot of sectors still going to have to get even bigger to survive? Let's talk about that from an arable perspective. First of all, Duncan, there's been an awful lot of consolidation already in the arable sector, but is there more to go?
I think the answer is yes. There is. If you actually break down the cost structure of arable farming, at a gross margin level, there's always improvements people can make, of course, but it's fairly there or thereabouts. When you start looking at fixed costs, there's a huge amount of difference across the bottom 25% and the top 25%, for instance. That tells you that there's more work to be done around consolidating fixed costs. Whether we like it or not, we have far too many combines, we have far too many tractors, we're burning far too much diesel, etc. across the industry. So there's still a lot we can do in terms of collaborating essentially and bringing that together. For me, that doesn't necessarily, it depends on what we mean by scale. I mean, scale isn't necessarily about farmers just simply getting bigger under less farmers farming more acres. It can be about medium-sized farmers, smaller farmers still retaining their ownership, still retaining the ability to make decisions, still farming their land in effect, but still sharing machinery between neighbouring farmers and perhaps even others further afield. Machinery does travel quite well. And there's a lot of other hidden benefits that comes through that as well, because I think from my experience where you see this happening, you set up groups of farmers that start to share and start to discuss and start to benchmark against each other, and it opens up other benefits as well that help improve the farms. Because without doubt, the progressive farmers out there, they want to learn, they're pushing the boundaries, they travel to other farms, they talk to other people, they benchmark, they're in discussion groups, etc. They've got itchy feet all the time. They're the ones that learn. So collaboration just at the fixed cost level is really important, I think, going forward, but the additional benefits of that mustn't be underestimated as well.
I'm sure you'll have thoughts on this from the dairy perspective too, but let's ask Josh the question. Josh, are dairy farmers still going to have to get bigger, or are they already butting up that environmental limit, with the slurry issues and all that?
Yeah.
Have we got the maximum, or what's the answer for the dairy sector, do you think?
I think there is going to be more consolidation, without doubt. It's getting harder and harder for the small family, very small farms, 100 cows and less to stay in business, and I can't see that getting any easier going forward. There is going to be a cap on it, like you say. Slurry management tends to put a cap on herd sizes in the UK, given the land that we're working with and the way that land tends to be sort of packaged up. So yeah, we're never going to end up to the same scale as you see in sort of Saudi and the US in parts, because we just don't have the land set up for that. But yeah, I think there's still going to be some consolidation for sure, for better or worse.
John, I'm going to ask you to put your neck on the line now. How many sheep should one shepherd be looking after in Wales, would you say, by the end of the decade?
Well, and this is a stage where I go into being politician mode and don't answer the question, isn't it? But the one thing I would say, it is a thought process that we need that economies of scale, and clearly when you're investing in quite heavy or expensive pieces of equipment, it kind of makes sense to think that you need to share that cost over more kilograms being produced. But what I would say on that, and we did quite a large red meat benchmarking project about 4 years ago, which had 1,600 farms give their kind of information into it. If the system isn't right, so is losing money, if you're bigger, you're just going to lose more money, is what I'd suggest on that. So there is a need to make sure that the system is working and is that the basics are fundamentally correct, be it a smaller size holding, a medium size, or large size holding, because that did come through in the results. If there was a problem, the bigger size units just lost more money. So the economies of scale does exist, but it's not necessarily the driver for profitability.
Okay, I won't call that a politician's answer. That was a good answer, but I still didn't quite hear a number. But I know it does vary a lot. We got a question here from Sandra Harvey. Thank you for sending in your question. Max, you might want to take this one on. She's asking, is it correct that soil samples should be taken at the same time each year, and that during the winter months is not accurate? When should that sampling be done?
Yeah, I think sampling at the same time each year is a good idea. I think that is the most important thing. I wouldn't say that sampling through winter months is not accurate. It can be quite a good time to sample. Quite often you don't want to sample immediately after harvest, because you can get a lot of, say, potash offtake in the straw, which could then be returned to the soil later on. So just think about when you are sampling. You don't want to sample, say, waterlogged soil, but I think that the key thing is to try and sample at a similar point of the year each time you sample.
Okay, good advice. Thanks, Max. We've got about 5 minutes left, so do keep those questions coming in. But we'll just go around the panel, perhaps finally, each some final thoughts. Let's start with you again, John. We'll just come back if we've got some young farmers on viewing us this evening. What's even if they're not running the enterprise yet, what's one piece of advice for them that they can perhaps take into their work with the cattle or the sheep over the next few months as lambing and calving hits?
One, obviously enjoy it, because that's the biggest thing. Is we're in it every day, so we need to enjoy it, and that needs to be. But I think it's been touched on a few times today. Start measuring, whatever it may be. Obviously, there are some key KPIs that we could all identify, but start measuring to understand performance, and that's the key point. And an inquisitive mind will want to know more. So if you start with just start measuring, whether it's animal performance, whether it's grass measurements, whatever that may be, but there's no such thing as too much data in some ways. So start at that point and then set yourself a challenge about, let's improve that for next year, and then you start looking at how do we do that and move forward.
Josh, what about one tweak for a dairy perspective? One or two things to try. You're on mute, sorry, Josh.
Sorry. I think it's the combination of thinking about the short term and the longer term at the same time. So it's very easy to get stuck in the here and now. We've talked about sort of being very reactive. Obviously, we need to be reactive. If you've got a problem, it needs addressing, but also thinking long term as well. So, in the short term, coming back to the pneumonia outbreak, thinking how we improve the shed so this doesn't happen next year. So that's a fairly short term fix. We can improve things from an efficiency point of view for next year by decreasing levels of disease from what we've learned this time, but also thinking, okay, well, let's invest in future, tech, genetics, and things that are going to have a slightly longer term ROI to them. So it's that combination of thinking short and long term, I think.
All right. So what I'm getting from that is get up on the roof tomorrow with your claw hammer and pull some sheets off the shed. Was it?
Depends on your shed. There are plenty that could do with that treatment. Yeah.
Do be safe if you go and do that tomorrow, please. I don't want to hear that anyone's fallen off a ladder. Duncan, from an arable perspective, then, or a dairy one, if you'd rather, small tweaks, but perhaps for the younger farmers to think about trying to influence the older generation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of cross industry really, and it's already been touched on, but be clear about what you're trying to achieve, be clear about your vision and goals. I'm a chairman of a big dairy farming business, and I still spend time each year with the directors of that business going through their individual personal goals, because they're really important, because that needs to drive the rest of the business as well. But then just be restless, just learn, go and speak to people. I mean, it's been touched on a lot, and I agree entirely. You've got experts surrounding you like vets and nutritionalists, etc. But fellow farmers, there's so many people around the industry. So go and talk to people. Accept that you do not know all the answers, and accept you don't need to know all the answers either. But go and learn, go and experiment, go and try things. Push the boundaries of what you're doing. Just try not to fall too far over the other side of the wave, of course. But yeah, push the boundaries. It's a really I think it's an incredibly exciting time for the industry at the moment. Really, really exciting time, particularly for new guys coming into the industry at the moment. Great time.
Max, we'll give you the final words. Oh, and you're on mute as well. Forgive me. Only 2 fines this evening. There you go.
Cool. Cheers, Andrew. Yeah, I think my advice would be keep an open mind, be open to change, be open to adopting new technology as it comes along. The rise of technology is unstoppable, and we are on this cusp of another revolution in agriculture, where there are going to be so many new digital tools at our disposal. So I think the opportunities are enormous, but just try and be focused. So don't adopt technology for technology's sake. Identify what the issues or challenges you face, and then see what technology is out there to help you face those.
Brilliant. Well, the message I got there is there's so many things we got through, but you're not alone. There's so much help out there. It's a really exciting time for the industry, and just start to try things. That's the 3 key messages, I think, from our first panel, and unfortunately that's all we have time for with them. My thanks once more to Joshua, Matt, Duncan and John for being so generous with their time and expertise this evening. We're going to roll straight into our second discussion in a few minutes, where we focus on driving productivity in terms of business structure and management, as well as hear from grassland and fertilizer experts. But first, it's time for our second transition partner video of the evening from seed breeder KWS. And before we play that, let me just remind you that once that finishes, you will need to navigate to a separate window for the second part of this evening's presentation. After the video, please click the overview button on the right-hand side of your screen if you're on a computer or laptop, or underneath the playing window if you're on a mobile device. And there's a link that says, please click here to watch part 2, where you'll join the auditorium for the second panel. But now let's watch the second transition partner video of the evening from KWS.
How varietal choice can help reduce the effects of climate change. There's no doubt about it. The UK's climate is changing, and the way we grow our crops is changing too. Whilst it's unlikely we can reserve new weather patterns in the short term, the management decisions growers make in the future could do much to minimise the effects of the more volatile growing conditions predicted. When it comes to varieties, there are 5 critical areas where the choices growers make can help them build resilience into their farming systems and allow them to withstand the worst effects of climate change. Number 1, focus on vigour. Choosing varieties with high natural vigour will help crops establish well, compete strongly against pest and weed threats, and create the correct foundation for yield building later in the growing season. Inbuilt spring vigour also allows plants to make full use of lengthening days and the consequent increase in photosynthesis, whilst ensuring crop inputs and nutrients are made full use of as the plant grows. Variety focus, get up and go. KWS Cranium is a great example of a high vigour, high yielding Group 4 winter wheat. Although well suited to mainstream sowing times, its inbuilt get up and go means it excels in late drilling slots where it out-yields even the best late drillers on the RL today. Number 2, think carefully about variety scheduling. Balancing a variety portfolio carefully and planning drilling schedules wisely to take full advantage of each variety's inherent properties will always pay dividends. Such an approach will not only ensure each variety performs to its full potential, it will also add flexibility and increase drilling options if autumn conditions develop for the worse as the season develops. Variety focus. Flexibility is key. A variety like KWS Firefly can be a great insurance policy in difficult years, with its 6-month drilling window from early September to the end of February, adding that vital flexibility to any cropping portfolio. Number 3, use disease resistance properly. Later drilling will help mitigate against the risks of septoria, so using varieties with good disease resistance earlier in the drilling schedule can ensure high yielders are not exposed. Whilst optimum disease control in the future will be based on getting the most out of chemistry and genetics working together, more changeable growing conditions are likely to affect the number of spray days available at the most critical times. Strong disease resistance can therefore be of considerable benefit in reducing dependence on the sprayer in difficult conditions. Depending on the system, decisions made around variety choice can also be used to complement your spray programme by extending the available window or bringing optimum timings together so applications can be completed in a shorter time frame. Variety focus, adding resilience. KWS X-Day is now one of the UK's most popular wheats, has outstanding disease resistance and untreated yield potential, and is a great inclusion for adding resilience to variety portfolios. Number 4, don't underestimate the importance of drought tolerance and lodging resistance. Early summer is likely to be a more precarious time in the future than in recent years, according to the latest UK climate models. Not only are droughts likely to be a more frequent occurrence, especially in the main crop growing parts of the country, more turbulent growing conditions will add stress to standing crops, meaning lodging is likely to be more of an issue. Choosing varieties that have a proven track record of drought tolerance and lodging resistance will therefore be a wise decision for the future. Variety focus, keep standing. The greater security in the field offered by a strong-strawed variety like KWS Cranium or KWS Dorsum can minimise yield losses through lodging, potentially reducing PGR use and save required drying time. Number 5, think harvest before you drill. Thinking about harvest dates before you drill can not only help spread workloads, it can also help make sure as much of the crop is safely combined before the risk of worse weather becomes a reality. There is a lot, therefore, to be said for including some real early harvesters in your cropping plans to manage risks. Variety focus, harvest home. A super early wheat like KWS Parkin ensures a potential July harvest date, allowing growers to protect incomes from spreading harvest workloads and getting the grain safely in the shed. So whilst nobody is underestimating the effects of climate change could have on the UK crop production in the future, thinking about its implications and choosing varieties carefully could go a long way to mitigating against the worst of its effects.
All right. My thanks to KWS for highlighting the importance of resilience in that video a surefire way to help reduce input spend as well as help the environment. Now it's time for our second panel discussion of the evening, as promised, and I'm delighted to be joined by three more distinguished guests to help carry on the discussion around productivity. So with me now are Ben Wixie, the National Agricultural Sales Manager with Grass Seed Company Germinal. In the last 21 years of work within the ruminant sector, Ben says he has seen huge breeding developments in grass and clover, making more sustainable production from forage possible. We also have Sajad Awan, company agronomist with CF Fertilizers. Since joining CF last year, his focus has been on leading the CF Research and Development Programme, including on-farm trials to help farmers improve nitrogen fertilizer use efficiency, a very hot topic. And finally, Jonathan Armitage, Head of Farming at consultancy firm Stratton Parker. Many of you will know Jonathan in the industry for his work in all aspects of farm business management. So let's get straight into it with you, Jonathan. You were telling me recently that productivity gains aren't just made in the field, are they? But they also can be done in the office by looking at farm business structure and other management tweaks. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that to start things off?
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, good to be here. Productivity to me starts with people. All the time, people make management decisions and people put those decisions into practice. I did some work a couple of years ago on looking at the performance of all of the farms that we look after, and it became apparent to us over time that some people or some farming businesses were, continually performing somewhere near the top of the pile, and some of them are at the other end of the spectrum. And we were asking ourselves why this was. And when you looked at the detail of those farming businesses, you realised that they were on different soil types, they were growing different sorts of crops. There was nothing really uniform about those businesses. And so then we looked at the individuals concerned who were managing those businesses, and those people all had very similar attributes. And I won't go into all the details of what those attributes were, but that was a really positive message for me. And I think it's probably the best message you could come out with, which is that people can really make a difference to profitability and to productivity on farms. So yeah, there are two sorts of productivity improvements. Really, there's those incremental productivity improvements that you can make over time, and that's all about, dare I be glib, that's all about doing everything better, and it's often about doing less rather than doing more, but doing less and doing them better. Having said that, you've got to accept that, we've all talked about the basic payment scheme going, and for most farmers in that middle ground of farming, the basic payment scheme still forms a massive proportion of their profit. And as that goes, it's unlikely that incremental changes are going to be some of the things that really help those farming businesses. And step change is what's required. And step changes in productivity require step changes in business structures and in how you actually go about the process of farming and size of business and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to be done in that space of structuring your business properly in order to take advantage of some really big step changes in productivity.
I'm sure there's a lot of ways into this, and so much of this, we almost can't help talking in generalities because every farm business is different. But what is there without obviously identifying them, is there a farm business that you can share some details of where you've cut through some of these issues and really helped them make the farm fit the land, fit the setup that they have, whereas before, there was some real barriers going on? Maybe they've done some labour sharing or something really dramatic like that.
Yeah, it'd be really tempting to try and talk about some of the really massive restructuring things that we've all been involved with and so on. But I think what's really important to put over is that not everything needs to be a massive shake-up and a massive change. You can make some big changes piecemeal. So yeah, I was involved with a business a few years ago now where two neighboring businesses came together, and one of the things they had a requirement for, in this case, a new combine, as is very often the case, and they decided they wanted to share that between them. And it was pretty straightforward to organize between two consenting adults, in this case, an arrangement where they could organize who was going to own the machine, how the costs of ownership and the costs of running the machine would be paid for, and come up with a very simple structure to do that between the two of them. And of course, that was so successful that the next time something else needed replacing on one of the farms, they made the same decision again. And you can add incrementally to that sort of thing. And it's not until you get to really complex issues when people really want to share, cropping decisions between themselves and those sorts of things, that you need to put something more complex in place to deal with it. So, if there's any message to give out, it's that these aren't always hugely big, scary decisions to make. You can deal with them, and that was a particular case in point.
Brilliant. So Jad, talking about big changes and small changes, it probably seems like a good idea to bring you in here with all the focus on nitrogen and the most efficient use of it this year because of that cost backdrop. Are some of the farmers you working in making sweeping changes, big cuts, or is it all about little tweaks here and there? What's the answer, would you say?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here. Now, we have conducted trials across the country last year, starting from Southwest all the way up into the Northeast. And the reason that we conducted those trials, we just wanted to make sure that we cover all sorts of variations. And one thing that we have picked up previously while I was working with ADAS, we had a project with ADAS, and we found out a very important factor that we called farm factor. That meant that no matter what you do, what sort of condition you are in, if the attention to detail isn't there is very little chance that you would be able to make much improvement in what you are doing. So that's one thing that I thought that's worth sharing. The second thing about your question means farmers have been trying seriously over the past 2 decades at least. And I think it has paid its dividends as well. Means if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions over the past 20 years or so, especially in Northwestern Europe, you would see that actually there hasn't been a lot of increase, although the yields have either improved or stayed the same in different cases, but the emissions haven't changed. The farmers have done their best, but there are a few things that I would like to highlight here. And one of the things, most important things, is that when we collect data, for instance, we did a soil test 10, 15, 20 years ago, we need to keep a record of that soil test. So that test is not there just for sake of knowing that this is the amount of nitrogen is in there, or phosphorus or potassium indices. It's there so that you could fully utilize the information that you're gathering. So once you've got data from 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you look back at all that information and you see in which direction you're heading. So last year you applied, for instance, 220 kilo of nitrogen. How much yield did you get? The year before you applied, the weather conditions, they do affect, but there are some management issues that we need to address as well. Farmers have done a lot, especially in arable circumstances. There is a room for improvement. I could see from the trials that we did, but the massive gains will be in grassland sector. I see that if you compared the two sectors in arable and grassland, you would see that 85% up to maybe 90% now, farmers, they are doing their soil tests regularly. Whereas in grassland sector, this number is much low. This is around 60%. So if we want to improve our efficiencies and productivity at the same time, we must know what is already present in our system. And once
if I may just cut in there, we'll come back to a little bit more advice in a minute, but I must give Ben an opportunity to respond on that grassland v arable point. Ben, do you agree? Have the arable farmers, they've done a lot of the legwork perhaps by and large, and are they a bit further ahead of their grassland neighbours in terms of nitrogen use?
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everybody. Yes, I think it's fair to say on the whole that is the case. Most grassland farmers I know tend, not all of them by any stretch, but tend to check their soil indices around the time of reseeding. So if they're going to do a reseed, then they check where they are, address it before they reseed, and then go in with the reseed. And that is true. One of the facts and figures that I quote a fair bit is over the years when we've looked at grassland farmers, and AHDB backed this up, the average production from a dairy farm for grass dry matter is around 8 tons of dry matter per hectare per year. On a beef farm, it's around 6 ton, and on a lamb, on a sheep farm, it's about 4 ton. The grass and clovers themselves are capable of doing twice that quantity. So there is huge potential there with the right nutrition. Now, not every farm is the same, and not every farm has the potential to grow 15 tons. We all understand that. But there are benefits that can be had by checking these nutrient values, because the plants don't react well if the pH is incorrect. You are throwing money away. So yes, it's something that we need to overall get better at in the grassland industries. I will caveat with that there are people that are doing this wonderfully well.
Of course. High input possible, high output possible, but perhaps only, dare I say, with high input. Are you finding that farmers are coming to you looking for maybe different varieties or different mixes in the last couple of years as nitrogen prices have gone up? They want perhaps a sort of maybe a bit more of a middle of the road option?
Yeah, it's not been, I mean, in the last few months, it's been driven by nitrogen price. But before that, the last 18 months, it's more been driven by the volatility in the end market price. Whatever they're producing, whether it's meat or milk, that volatility needs to be counteracted by reducing your unit costs. And if you can reduce your unit costs, then the volatility in the market is not so painful. So there's never been as much interest in forage and production from forage from that point of view. And even, there's been some very interesting debates in the last few months. Even with the fertilizer prices where they are currently, it's still arguably the right policy to use fertilizer if you have the right grasses in your grass lay to take those fertilizers up and produce your quality dry matter. It still pays. It still pays on brassicas, out wintering crops, things like that. It's obviously not as pleasant as when it was a third of the price that it is now, but it still pays. On the other note, we've never had so much interest in clover over a winter. And clover is obviously a massive part of this whole equation on productivity going forward. It isn't the be all and end all of everything. It does fix nitrogen clearly. It has other benefits as well. But we've never had as much interest in clover as is going on currently.
Jonathan, we touched on output versus margin a bit in the first discussion, but perhaps it bears repeating. So from your perspective, should we be moving on from output, and what proportion of farmers do you think are still in a output at all cost mindset?
Quite a lot of them, I expect, are still in that case. It is true to say that when you look at certainly on the arable side, the broadacre arable side, then the most profitable farms are also the highest yielding farms. And that's where the biggest margins still are. You look at what's happening to prices today. I'm not talking about the price of fertilizer now. I'm talking about the price of wheat and barley and rape and so on. It still makes sense to drive production. The alternative to move to lower input strategies is, for a lot of people, a risk, actually. Whilst it takes away some production risk because you're not investing quite so much money in inputs, it's risk because it's more difficult for you to determine the impact on outputs. So, well, Sajid will remind us all that, we've got some very, very clear charts that will show us optimum levels of nitrogen to be applied, and the response to nitrogen is incredibly well known, whereas some of the other lower input techniques are on paper fabulous, of course, but the impact is less easily determined, so it represents a risk.
Take it away, Sajad.
Yeah, I mean, this is something which is the most important, and probably I wanted to discuss in greater detail here because we've got the opportunity. I always say that farming is a business, it's not a hobby. And in order to stay afloat in a business, you got to have profit margins, good profit margins. And yield is one of the most important factors amongst all of it. When we are talking about the low input system, that means that we are also, in some cases, not in all cases, in some cases, we're also talking about that there is a risk, real risk, that we would lose yield. And that means when the grain price is as high and the premium as high as never before, this still makes sense that you apply optimum amount of nitrogen. Now, what stands optimum? There has been a lot of talk about the optimum, but it is a point where you feel that beyond that point, you're not getting value for your money. So at that point, you don't want to risk losing your yield, but you don't want to over-apply for several reasons. One of those reasons is also environment. So when we are talking about a low input, reducing our yield, that means that we are also thinking in terms of imports. And one of the things that we might well have remembered from early days of COVID, nobody cared about anything else apart from food. So food shopping. So let's get our food. Don't care about anything else. That meant that the food sits at the top of our agenda, and we do not, especially in these times. It means these are exceptional circumstances that we haven't seen in several generations. So what we really don't want is that we lose sight of independence, being, food security that we have in this country, especially for cereals. We don't want to lose sight on that. So we want to make sure that we do not depend on other countries. And another very important point here is that we in the UK, Northwest Europe, we are blessed. The best climatic conditions for agriculture, especially, some of the crops that we grow at. If you took similar land use to another country, let's say that we reduce our yield, we reduce our input to an extent, we have managed to reduce our overall yield. That means that we will have to import from somewhere, and somebody somewhere needs to either clear out their grasslands or their rainforest, and they will have to produce for us. That means the impact, global impact on environment will be on much bigger scale. There are several publications you might find on the internet clearly showing that if we moved our production elsewhere, that means that we are reducing our environmental efficiency, and this is something that we seriously don't want to do.
Andrew, sorry, can I just jump in there, Andrew?
Please.
Just on the forage and grass and livestock side of you, yield is obviously massively important. If you get to the end of the winter and there's no silage left in the pit, that's an issue. So yield is massively important, but quality of the product that we're producing is also hugely important, and that comes from, to move the conversation slightly away from nitrogen, that comes from the management and these skills that we may have lost over the last generation, but that are there in terms of grassland management and feeding the animals at the right time and cutting silages at the right time. It just, for us in the livestock sector, it is about yield, of course it is, but it's also about having a quality product to feed these animals to get the best productivity out of them.
Well, let's talk a bit about that aftercare then. So is it fair to say that perhaps your business, it doesn't stop the moment you sell the farmer the seed? Then what's sort of advice that you're giving people to help manage that quality and also the longevity of a lay, because the cost of it will come down so much if it has a longer lifespan before it needs the next reseed, won't it?
Yeah. So if you look at what we're doing in terms of working with farmers, we're trying to produce more for less. So we're trying to get more grass, more production from less inputs. So we're either increasing in yield, and that might be in terms of fertilizer regime. It might be in terms of using clover or herbs. But also very often it's about grazing the plants at the right time or cutting them at the right stage of growth. Because a grass plant needs to grow, it needs to have a photovoltaic cell, a leaf to trap sunlight, photosynthesize and produce more grass. The old saying, grass grows grass. So by rotationally grazing, we can increase the production per hectare without necessarily increasing the inputs. There was some work went on in mid Wales a few years ago now, where on a sheep farm, where just by introducing rotational grazing and nothing else, doubling the number of livestock there, because you can produce more dry matter and more quality dry matter to finish more lambs off just from rotational grazing. So getting the grass plant at the right time and growing that is important. Choosing quality is hugely important from the start. I think the film before we started was from KWS, and I remember watching it the other day, and they talk about the recommended list and the difference between wheat varieties on the recommended list. There is a grass and forage recommended list. The difference between the top variety and the bottom variety on that recommended list has a financial penalty 3 times that of the one on the cereal list. Yet people don't look at it. So there's independent trial work out there with grass and clover recommended list that you can get hold of, and you can see what grass varieties are performing where and doing what. And it has huge benefits and huge, if you change nothing else, but you just change the grass varieties you grow, then yes, that has a massive benefit. And the other idea is introducing these clovers, high sugar grasses. We're developing all the time new species coming through. Festiloliums, we've just got the first fully recommended perennial festilolium on the ground. So going back to your longevity question, that is a perennial ryegrass that has some of the fescue characteristics, and will be able to improve in drought tolerance and waterlogging situations and survive better in those environments. In terms of grass lays, it really is horses for courses. The perennials that we put in the ground respond well to nitrogen. They're very digestible. They're quality grasses. They're high yielding, but they do not last under bad management. So they die out over time. So that comes down to how we manage the grass and how long the grass lays last, and also the rotation that they're going into. It might be a benefit to have a 4-year red clover sward to produce high protein homegrown forage, and then go back into the arable rotation. So the overall cost of the grass lay, the grass seed itself is about 30 to 40% of the work to put a grass seed in the ground. So to put a new lay in the ground. So overall, the price of grass seed is not that relevant. And over the number of years, compared to the energy that you get back, the cost of it is insignificant compared to the returns on it.
Okay. So, Jonathan, it sounds like from what we've been hearing from our colleagues here, there's probably not much excuse for finishing certainly lambs off anything else but grass. You know, how do farmers, when they're thinking about their system, come to make those decisions? Particularly, perhaps let's look at livestock for a moment, about what balancing these issues between efficiency and when to use food versus margin. You know, what's the sort of data that they should be collecting, you think, for those sort of nutritional questions?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, Andrew. So there's all sorts going in here. Ben is talking particularly about plant genetics, and of course that genetics in all of livestock production, whether it's the fodder that they're fed or whether it's their own genetics in converting that fodder into live weight gain or milk or whatever it happens to be, is massively important. You see in you look at the difference in performance in the dairy sector, for instance, between the best and the worst, and the biggest difference between them is output, and some of the levels of inputs. So I'm talking about fodder inputs and so on. Is pretty similar across. All the way from the bottom 25% performers all the way to the top 25% of performers, and indeed their labour and machinery requirements from those farms is different. So it's all about technical management in those livestock systems. So it's about measuring live weight gain and so on. Some of the fantastic businesses that I've looked at using robotic feeding systems and with individually small groups of penned animals. This was a beef system I'm talking about now. So small groups of individually penned animals. They're weighed every time they went for a drink at the trough. They were weighed. Their live weight gain was monitored on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. And it allowed them to produce. I mean, that was a business that had 4,000 head cattle managed by 2 people and some robots, and it was incredibly impressive in terms of overall productivity.
Let's just hone in on labour for a second there, then, because that's a really crucial point you've hit on. It feels like every farmer WhatsApp group I'm in at the moment, every time I pick up the phone nearly and I'm talking to an employer, they're trying to recruit and they're struggling. I'm sure that's what you're hearing as well. Is it inevitable then that we need, by the end of the decade, perhaps, not just in horticulture, but in all systems, to be managing more livestock or more acres, more hectares with fewer people, or have we already reached the limits of that mostly?
I think size is important, but it's not everything. And I've got plenty of examples of really efficient businesses that aren't massively huge businesses. But as I said right at the beginning of this piece, productivity starts with people, and it's not just managers that it starts with. It's people all the way through your team. So for instance, one of the attributes of the good managers that I was talking about earlier was their ability to build a team, and their team of people wasn't all people that they employed. It was them and their staff. It was their agronomist, their accountant, their business advisors, their grain trading consultants, their grain traders, and everybody became part of their team, and that was how they were seen. And so I think we have to be just a bit cleverer about how we think of our business and the team that we're in control of. Now, clearly, those managers made all their own decisions, but they took. I was going to say advice. What I meant, they took all of the information and advice that they received across their team, whether it was from their own sprayer operator or whether it was from their grain merchant, and made some, good, well-informed business decisions. So that's one point. The other point is that yes, labour is tight. It doesn't seem to matter which industry you talk about at the moment. Everybody is looking for good people. I tell you one meeting I was at when we were talking, some years ago now, we were talking about joint ventures and the benefits that joint ventures could bring, and in terms of saving labour and machinery and so on and so forth. And there was a group of farmers that we were talking to, and one farmer in the audience stood up at the Q&A session and said, well, I completely understand what you're saying about all of the money that I could save by having a joint venture and spreading my costs over a bigger area, or someone else spreading their costs over a bigger area of land. But my main concern is that my son or daughter won't have a job at the end of it. And that was a really telling comment, I thought, that these are some of the sort of family fears, and this is where a lot of labour comes from in agriculture, move over into the business. So of course, you have to make the point that that son or daughter might come back to a much better job than the one that might alternatively be on offer to them. So you can turn these things around and make a positive out of a potential negative. But there are all of those sorts of fears going on as well. But it's about working smarter. It's about looking after people, making your business somewhere where people want to come and work more than it's ever been before.
We've got a question coming now from Anthony Pope, and he's asking, what effect will no-till agriculture for arable or regen farming for livestock and reduced or changed level of inputs have on overall productivity and profitability? Jonathan, I know you've got some views on this. We'll just come back to you in a second. But so, Jad, you're working with all sorts of farming systems, and are you seeing big changes in nitrogen use depending on the type of farming system they're using, and how's that working out for those growers perhaps who have switched over to regen agriculture?
Yeah, it means now regenerative agriculture compared to conventional agriculture, and I know this is quite a hot topic and different people, they take this very seriously. Means regenerative agriculture means where you have got very limited soil disturbance or maybe none whatsoever. What we have seen working with the farmers over the past several years, what we have seen is that the first few years, the soils, because they are in a phase of change due to compaction or due to no ploughing, no metal going in the field, the fields, they behave slightly differently. You might have to, and there is an awful lot of evidence that the inputs initially, if you wanted to keep your yield same or slightly higher, you will have to apply more nitrogen. And this brings us back to the carbon to nitrogen ratio, because as you are putting in more straw, more material going back into the field, that means that the nitrogen, which is immobilized in cases, especially for the first 4, maybe 5 years, it all depends. Different soils, different regions of the country, they're highly variable. So by the time you reach a phase where the soil becomes productive for itself, it might take a while. But definitely, initially, first few years, there could be a yield penalty. You might have to apply slightly higher inputs. But eventually, people do get there to a point where the requirement for fertilizer, for inputs, they could be reduced. I can't tell you by how much because we haven't got the data in the UK. But the pros and the cons of the systems means I don't want to go into that detail, but on the other hand, the glyphosate dependence on glyphosate or other insecticides, that also increases. So yeah, people have tried successfully, others they haven't been so successful. One message is quite clear, that if you want to make a change, it doesn't have to be a regenerative agriculture. It doesn't have to be a conventional agriculture. You will have to do trial. You will have to experience for yourself. And that's why the sort of trials that we are doing with the farmers currently is that we are asking them to do the measurements by yourself on a very similar field under similar conditions, so that you know for yourself what works for you. And we are there to advise you, to guide you. But when the farmer, they start learning from themselves, that really makes a difference. And we have got some wonderful examples of people, who have switched to regenerative agriculture, and they have never looked back because, they were able to improve their gross margins and also reduce the impact of what they're doing on the environment.
Ben, establishment costs, that's a big thing with grass too, and obviously everything from scratching it into an existing lay right through to full tillage. I'm sure you'll agree with Sajjad, it's on a bit of a farm by farm basis, but what is your advice for those who are looking to cut costs with their establishment techniques? You're on mute, sorry, Ben.
Somebody had to do it, didn't they? There's still a lot to learn. Stitching in, overseeding. We see it time and time again where we'll stitch into an existing grass lay, and 12 months later we're patting ourselves on the back. The farmer's chuffed to bits. It's worked an absolute dream. So we do some more the next summer. And it's a complete disaster and nothing takes. And the difference between the two is very difficult to put your finger on as to why it happens. But in terms of costs, yes, it's a lot cheaper when it works. And from the Regen Ag point, there are many more species that we can bring in and establish into those swards from doing it that way. There is always going to be, or potentially there's always going to be, the situation where the fields need leveling or the rotation is such that actually a full reseed is required, and at that point there's no other way than to get on and give the full dose. So yeah, it's an area that we're working hard on at the research farm down in Wiltshire. We are looking at different seed treatments and different micronutrients to boost the effect of these seeds when you're drilling them into existing lays because of the competition effect, and different methods of drilling them in. And actually we're going to the extremes and trying all sorts of different things. Drilling in the middle of winter, going right outside to see if there's some methods of introducing grass into existing swards to bolster that without starting from scratch. But it's ongoing work.
We've got sort of a bit less than 10 minutes left. So, Jonathan, I want to ask you about productivity grants in a minute, but please first, I know you've been urging caution on farmers who are looking to try regen in the past. So just explain a bit of that from a productivity perspective first.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to come across as a negative towards regen, Andrew, but regenerative agriculture is all about improving soils, and who could possibly argue that was a bad thing? Of course, that has to be a target for everybody. I suppose my concern has come about as a consequence of people. I get the impression that people think that a transformation into regenerative agriculture is going to be the instant panacea for all of their productivity and profitability problems in the face of losing their basic payment scheme. And it's not, in a nutshell. But that's not to say that it is not a legitimate and warranted opportunity for people to take up in order to improve soils for long-term production resilience, and maintain at least margins. So even if yields are compromised, as Sajjad has suggested they might be, particularly in the early years of the transformation, if we can do that in a way that reduces input costs at the same time and we maintain margins, then that's brilliant. The other thing is that, and Sajjad alluded to this as well earlier, which was the sort of cost of making that transition. there are those people who say, well, I'm not just going to, sell all my current set of equipment and go and buy a whole load of new equipment to do something a bit different and keep my fingers crossed that it's going to work. So people are going to want to go into it with a bit more of their own experience. And that means that they're going to need to do some in a conventional way and some in a regenerative way. And that requires them to have access to two sets of machinery and equipment to do those sorts of jobs. And we mustn't underestimate the challenge of that in itself. So from a positive perspective, I have never known farmers to be more communicative with each other as they are at the moment, talking about all of these things. There's definitely a sense of sharing experiences and trying to learn from each other more than frankly I've ever known, and that's got to be a good thing, and long may that continue.
And just briefly then on these productivity grants that are on, just run through, would you sort of, are they worth it, and what's on offer at the moment then?
Just running through what DEFRA has on offer at the moment is a massive question, as anybody faced with the post from or the emails from DEFRA at the moment will understand. So the agriculture
productivity grants in particular.
Yes, okay, yeah. Right. I'll focus. So the Agriculture Act allowed us allowed the government to continue to pay farmers for productivity grants, and there are a couple of things that have come out of that. There's the on the sort of side of it, there's this Future Farming Resilience Fund, which is for payment for advisors to advise farmers on how to go about the transition. I think you may have talked about that a bit already, and we at Stratton Parker are doing that together with the AHDB to provide that free advice to farmers. But the main vehicle for DEFRA to provide grant funding is the Farming Investment Fund. The Farming Investment Fund again is split into two, really. There's the Farming Equipment and Technology Fund, which we've just the first window closed earlier this month, and that pays grants of up to £25,000 for the purchase of specific machinery and equipment aimed at helping productivity. I'm sure that would have been pretty popular, and there'd be some pretty easy wins there. There's then the Farming Transformation Fund, which is where bigger grant activity happens. I'm talking about grants up to £500,000 under the Transformation Fund, and within that there are a number of different grant schemes. So the first one that was launched was the water management grant. So that's all about reservoirs and irrigation and usage of water. And the next one is just launched the Improving Farm Productivity grant. That is for projects of a minimum of £87,500, and it is aimed specifically at robotics and a bit of slurry treatment as well, but mostly into the robotic section in primary agricultural production. And there's a window now open until the middle of March for people to look at eligibility and see whether they're eligible for those schemes going forwards. What I would say about all of those schemes is, of course, that they're all great, and of course, who wouldn't want somebody to help them pay for some machinery and equipment? But they are all about step changes in processes on farms, and that requires some big decisions to be made about how you're going to go about your business in the future. It's not simply about buying something off the shelf for a bit cheaper than I could have bought it before, because there are other changes in your business you're going to have to make at the same time. And one of the frankly unhelpful things about these schemes is a short lead-in time for businesses to make some decisions about what they want. I mean, in particular about the Farming Equipment and Technology Fund, we had a small window of opportunity announced, right at the beginning of the window over Christmas time. Do you want some machinery and equipment or not? And I suspect some of the things that people have applied for have been, there was grant funding for livestock handling systems and all that sort of thing, which frankly wouldn't require big changes on farm, but it's a great way to get something paid for. I'm not sure how efficiently that is a great spend of money, but I think farmers should take advantage of that as soon as they can.
All right. Well, we are looking like we're almost out of time. Ben and Sajad, just quickly, maybe a final point from each of you, if we can. As I asked the previous panel, what's the one tweak you'd advise a young farmer to make as they're looking to have an influence on their farming business this year? One from a grassland perspective, perhaps from you first of all, Ben.
The thing that the young farmers and one of the best skills that you've got is measuring it. We need to start measuring what we've got and monitoring it and grassland management skills based on those measurements. It doesn't have to be full-blown plate metering every week. It can be as simple as recording the number of trailers from a silage field or the number of grazings you get per year, to make these small changes to then set yourself goals to make sure that you're better the year after. But measuring it and managing it has to be the way forward.
Sajad, what about you?
Absolutely. I was actually, it's slightly in a different way, but I was about to say that data is your friend. So the more information that you can have on your farm, the better the understanding and the decision making you would have. So especially from in terms of soil analysis, then the type of nutrients that you used and how those nutrients under different timings, different weather conditions, and different pH they performed. You amalgamate, you use that data, and you look back, and then you make your decisions.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, something for the decision makers and everyone there at the end. So go and check out the slew of grants on offer there for farmers in England, and there'll be all sorts of schemes for farmers in the other nations also coming up this year, I'm sure, as they look to diverge into different directions of farm support, but and all sorts of things that every member of the business can do to support all those little different productivity tweaks that we've heard across both panels. I hope you will agree with me. We've had a brilliant run through at a breakneck speed this evening of the many ways productivity can be sharpened up across different aspects of farming, and it's left you with some inspiration to take into your own business, whether it's those huge step changes or the little modifications. But for now, thank you to my second panel, to Jonathan, Sajad and Ben, for all your time and expertise this evening. And if you're watching this live and you know that someone that wasn't able to join us at this hour and you think they'll find it interesting, then do please remind them that all of this will be available to watch on demand. In the coming days, just go to fwi.co.uk or check our YouTube channel. And please also take a moment to answer the poll that should be appearing on your screen shortly to leave us some feedback and help us make improvements in the future. This is just the first year of our transition project, and I'm sure we've got some productivity gains of our own that we can make, particularly my hosting skills. I'd like to thank our technical team, which has helped everything run smoothly this evening, and to all of our transition partners for helping make this whole series, this whole project possible. You can find out more information on everything we're up to at fwi.co.uk/transition. Finally, a huge thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. We'll be having our next Transition Summit on March the 17th, where we'll be tackling the earthy issue of successful soil in lots of detail, I'm sure. But for now, on behalf of everyone that's joined us this evening, thank you for coming along and good night.